So a lot of news while we were away. Andretti and General Motors announced that they are joining F1. A lot of buzz. People seem thrilled. Some people, I just don't know exactly who, seem against this. What do we make, Laurence, of the news that we are going to possibly have 11 teams in F1 in the coming future?
Well, I think the key word there is possibly, because as much as Andretti and GM, along with the Cadillac brand, want to be in Formula One, they have to still go through a fairly stringent selection process, which the FIA has said that it will start. And the FIA seem very, very keen for Andretti to be a big part of that, potentially the big part of that turns into an 11th Formula One team. But nothing's done yet. And really, like pretty much everything in Formula One, this boils down to money. At the moment, there are 10 teams in Formula One. They're run like franchises. They all get a split of the revenues of Formula One. And of course, if you add an 11th team, that split gets a bit smaller. So throughout last year, when Andretti, without GM backing and without Cadillac, were interested in coming into Formula One, the response from the majority of the teams and also kind of from F1 itself was like, well, what are you bringing? What value are you going to add? How are you going to increase the pie so that we all get a bigger slice rather than just taking your own little bit out of it? So that seems to be the big point that is going to be debated over the coming weeks and months. The teams on the whole, on the record at least, in public, have been fairly quiet about it, but there have been a few source stories out there of teams suggesting that they're not that happy about it. Again, really, I think for this reason of what Andretti and Cadillac are going to bring. And I think there's a few questions as well about what kind of involvement is this from Cadillac? Is this just a branding exercise like Alfa Romeo have with Sauber now? Or is it a full-on GM, we're going to throw everything at it, eventually perhaps even build their own power units further down the line? Sure. At the moment, they've said that they wouldn't do that. They'll probably have Renault power units, which was an existing deal that Andretti already had in place. And so there's a few questions about that. So until we get these details, of which Andretti didn't give many away when they talked to the press, it's really hard to know exactly where this is going to go. But the one thing we can say is that Andretti and Cadillac with GM are fully committed to doing it. And the FIA, which is half of the people who will decide on whether a new team comes in, the other half being Formula One, the commercial rights holders, Formula One management, the FIA half are very, very keen. So from there, we'll just have to see what everyone else says and where we end up.
Always a waiting game, I feel like, with everything. Nate, I'm curious, what would be like the percentage? Obviously, a lot of companies, a lot of people want to get involved in the sport as it's just grown exponentially and continues to, and it doesn't look like it's stopping. What is the percentage of a team being able to enter? Do we think that this is 90% success rate here with this partnership? Would you put it at 30%? There's going to be a lot of hoops and you don't know if they're able to get it done. Where would you put that finish line?
Yeah, it's a tough one, isn't it? I think this is a heart versus head one as well. Like, you would want it to be easy. You'd want it to be like a 90% chance. But Laurence kind of alluded to it there. F1 teams, I don't know if people know this. This might be us breaking news, but F1 teams are pretty greedy. They like holding on to what they've got currently. And especially with where F1 is right now, the money that is coming in, we haven't seen it like this for a long time. So I would say, I think it's less than 50% if you consider all of those things. I think the really key thing actually is going to be, we seem to be heading towards, I think, something we're going to talk about quite a lot this year, which is FIA versus F1. And the teams are very much kind of on the F1 side of that divide. And as Laurence mentioned there, the FIA have kind of hinted that this process is starting. F1, we've heard the teams aren't so keen on it. So this will be a real test, I think, of the president and of the governing body to see how they can kind of corral those teams together, convince them that this is something that is worth doing, that this is something that's worth supporting. I mean, personally, I would love it. I think it's a fantastic opportunity. I mean, growing up, Formula One, it always had more than 20 cars on the grid. And I think it's always a sign of the sport. If you're bringing in new teams, you're bringing in new competitors. It's obviously great for young drivers. There's more sponsorships involved. I think there's a lot of, there's obviously always bad things that come with a new entry coming in, but I think it would be quite short-sighted to turn Andretti down. In the short term, I think these teams would lose money, but Michael Andretti seems very serious about it. So on that side of it, it seems a lot more likely than what I said before. So when you consider the seriousness of Andretti's proposal, you would say it's over 50%. It seems a lot more likely, but the big hurdle is going to be getting those teams on board.
So Toni, head and heart, as a fan clearly of the sport, as somebody who covers the sport, Good thing, bad thing, right time, wrong time?
Ooh, I definitely think right time. I'm looking at it right now as like a no-lose scenario versus a win-win. It's like a no-lose. Let's give it a shot. I think people also forget that Andretti comes with such a loyal fan base as well. So at a time where F1 is keen to tap into that American audience, Andretti definitely comes, if you're talking about the heart of the sport, with those diehard motorsport fans and Andretti fans. So I think there's something exciting there. I think we often always forget, or I definitely forget, that, the FIA doesn't cap the grid to 20 drivers, 10 teams, as Nate was saying. We definitely can have, up to 26 cars, 13 teams. And I was thinking about, when was the last time we had 11 teams on the grid? And it was 2016. So it both feels like a long time ago and not that long ago. And then as I was doing my digging, I was like, wait, so actually the newest addition and most successful addition to the Formula One grid has been Haas. And so that's an interesting one to look at. Is like, do you look at Haas as a success story or not? And I think that sort of sets the future of what Andretti has to deal with as it's coming in, because it's no small venture. It's not an easy win-win, that one, of joining a new grid. Or being a new team, joining an existing grid that has already so many existing teams with such legacy. They've got a leg up.
The Haas example is really interesting because F1 really needed Haas when it came in, because there was teams that were falling apart. Marussia was on its way out, and so it was really important that Haas came in, but they did it in a completely different way. They kind of upturned the whole business model in an F1 team, and they basically bought all the underpinnings from Ferrari, and then they did everything they needed to do on top, but they outsourced the manufacturing to Dallara and all this kind of stuff. So it's important. But then also Haas as a team, only a year ago, they were on the verge of collapse, and they needed money from the Mazepins essentially to keep them going. So I think this is the other side of the argument where F1 and the teams want to be a little bit careful, is that if you had 10 teams within F1 all spending up to 140 million in the budget cap and making a profit, then yes, clearly there's a little bit of leeway for other teams to come in. If you have teams that are still struggling a bit, and Williams of course had backing from Dorilton, but long-term future isn't entirely secure, car still seems fairly void of sponsors. You look at that kind of thing, you're like, well, if you add another team in there, then they're going to start taking away and taking sponsors, and obviously taking money and resources as well, and obviously engineering talent. So the question is, can F1 support 11 teams at the moment? And I think they do have to be careful with that. On the other hand, a brand like Cadillac, it's almost like this is exactly what F1 needed. Like, F1's been chasing the US market, and then one of the biggest, I mean, Katie, you'll be able to speak to this, what Cadillac means in the US, but when I think of it, it's like the ultimate luxury car. I still think of like the 70s and 80s Cadillacs, which are just really cool looking things.
Boats.
Boats, which is actually not that F1, but still huge and a big brand in the imagination in the US. So yeah, it's a tough one. It's balancing that is really tough. But I think you do have to make sure that you don't end up in a situation where you let Andretti and Cadillac in, and then you maybe lose Williams and Haas along the way or something like that. Then the other factor is, and this is another reason why F1 didn't come out entirely supportive of it, is that they said, well, the Andretti Cadillac proposal is the most public, most visible one, but there's other people interested as well. And so they need to analyze all of them. And if one of those is, say, Honda, for example, which we know have signed up to the 2026 engine rules, even though only a couple of years ago they said they were leaving the sport. If a big brand like Honda comes in and wants to do its own factory team, well, that's a pretty serious proposal to go up against Cadillac and Andretti, especially if Cadillac aren't willing to really get involved in the nuts and bolts and oil of the engine. So it's a real interesting one to balance. There's so many things going on, but what I'd hate to see is that just as F1 gets to a point where it looks like it has 10 stable teams, it rocks the boat and creates a situation like we had the last time we had a big influx of teams, which was 2010, when we had Hispania, they were called Team Lotus at the time. They later became Caterham. Manor, essentially, that was Virgin at the time, became Marussia. And then there was also US F1 that was meant to come in, a fourth team, didn't even make it to the grid. So you have to look back and learn the lessons of that as well. That was a very different situation. Those teams had been told there was a budget cap, then there wasn't. But it's still creating an environment in which these teams can thrive and exist and hopefully succeed and be competitive, because you don't want a situation like we had then, where you have we had 24 cars on the grid, but 6 of them were basically in a different category, so far off the back. So these are all the things F1's balancing up.
And obviously they want to capitalize on the popularity and the growth within the United States as we get prepared for 3 races in the States this upcoming season. Toni, to your point, Andretti comes with a large following. Nate, I'm just curious, with that, how does an Andretti team move the needle in America? I mean, you've been to COTA, you've seen 450 plus fans, 1,000 fans come throughout a weekend. Does it move the needle that much that it's advantageous, or do you worry about the delusion?
I think the Andretti name is big, and it's bigger than I realized when I went to the Indy 500 in 2017. I really realized that. I think there's probably only a few names in America that people actually think of. This is a racing driver. You've got Earnhardt. I think a lot of people know Andretti, probably from Mario. A lot of older fans might know the name Mario. Obviously, Michael's run the team for a long, long time. So I think it definitely feels more American to a casual fan, I would say, than the Haas team does. Haas has made no kind of qualms about the fact that Gene Haas is there to sell his machine tool product, which is what's all over the car. He doesn't have the American flag there. So I think that American side of it, I think would really help. I think, and we know that Michael Andretti, when he was trying to get into F1 before, his part of his plan was to have Colton Herta there as well. Mm-hmm. So I think having that American driver, I know we've got Logan Sargent coming in, but American driver, American team, I think that would move the needle in quite a way. And I think, as Toni mentioned, Andretti has this pedigree that a lot of fans, it's not like they have to learn what the team's about. They don't have to learn what Andretti's about. They don't really have to learn what Cadillac's about. If you drive around in America, you see Cadillacs, all the time. And usually, that's when you have to keep your eye on the road, because you might, you're kind of looking to one side like, oh, there's a Cadillac here. So yeah, I think all of those things together mean it should, in theory, on paper, be quite an easy sell for the US market. So I think that that is, you would think, is a big positive for the team. But I don't know. I mean, I was trying to think before we did this show, are there any obvious glaring disadvantages of having the Andretti name in there? And I can't really think of any. I mean, Laurence mentioned about the other teams, which is a really good point. But in terms of the Andretti entry itself, it seems pretty solid. So, coming in from that perspective, you'd be confident that they could at least stay around for the long term. But obviously, the budget cap there is kind of doing its job. If Andretti come in, the budget cap helps teams come in, helps them. They know they're not going to be competing against a team spending 600 million next year. Everybody's going to be spending the same amount of money, or at least capped at the same amount of money. So that will help them as well. So yeah, I think we're in a good place with them.
Thanks for watching ESPN on YouTube. And for more sports highlights and analysis, be sure to download the ESPN app. And for premium content plus live streaming, make sure to subscribe to ESPN Player.